I sat silently while my daughter-in-law called me a pathetic embarrassment in front of her guests, never once suspecting that I secretly held 46% of the law firm where she had just made partner. The champagne glass in my hand had gone warm by the time Devin found me. I was standing near the dessert table in her living room in Charlotte, wearing my Old Navy dress and Walter's pearls, watching 30 strangers in silk and pressed suits laugh at jokes I didn't understand. The chandelier threw gold light across marble floors. Catering staff moved through the crowd with trays of things I couldn't pronounce. It was September 20th, a Saturday, and Devin had just made partner at Ashcroft, Pruitt & Lang. She looked radiant, every inch the woman she had spent 6 years working to become. Devin appeared at my elbow like she'd been waiting for the moment I'd finally relax. "I told Caleb not to invite you," she said quietly, her smile fixed for the room. "Stay by the food, don't speak to the Callahans." I opened my mouth to answer. Marjorie Callahan turned toward us just then, warmth already spreading across her face. She'd known me since Caleb was in diapers, since before Walter died, since before any of this. "Eleanor," Marjorie said, reaching for my hand, "I haven't seen you in ages. How have you—" Devin cut her off before she finished the sentence. "Marjorie, this is Caleb's sweet little mother." Her voice rose, pitched for an audience now. "Please don't make her feel important. It'll only embarrass everyone." The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent the way a pond goes still, ripple by ripple, conversation by conversation, until 30 people were watching a 67-year-old woman standing alone by a dessert table with a warm glass of champagne in her hand. My son was across the room. He was laughing at something one of the junior partners said, his back half turned, completely unaware that his wife had just called his mother an embarrassment in front of his in-laws' social circle. I set my glass down on the marble counter. I looked for Caleb one more time. And then Devin, perhaps sensing the room hadn't fully absorbed what she'd said, raised her voice again, loud enough that it carried past the kitchen island and into the hallway where I could see Wren, my 8-year-old granddaughter, peering out from behind the banister in her nightgown. "Can someone please get this embarrassment out of my house before the Hendersons see her?" 14 people heard it. I counted later, in my head, in the car. 14 faces that turned toward me and then quickly away. The particular embarrassment of watching someone else's humiliation up close. I did not cry. I did not argue. I walked across that living room, past caterers and lawyers, and a woman named Devin Ashcroft who did not know a single true thing about me, and I found my son by the bar. "I'm heading home, sweetheart," I told him, and kissed his cheek. "I love you. Congratulate Devin again for me." He frowned, already half drunk on champagne and pride. "You're leaving already?" "The night's just getting started, Mom. I'm tired," I said. 67-year-old bones. I did not tell him what his wife had said. Not that night. I have never been the kind of mother who makes her son choose. I walked out through the front door, past the valet, and got into my car. I did not start the engine right away. I sat there in the dark for 10 minutes, hands folded in my lap, and I was not crying. I was calculating. Here is what Devin never bothered to learn about me in 6 years of marriage to my son. I did not just own a modest rental property or two, the little duplex she liked to reference at dinner parties, as though it summed up my entire net worth. I owned 41 properties across 3 states. And 11 years earlier, through a real estate transaction most people would have forgotten by now, I had quietly acquired a 46% equity stake in a small, respected law firm, the very same firm that had just made her partner. I started the car. I did not go home first. I drove to my attorney's office, even though it was nearly 10 at night, because I knew Renata Ford kept a light on in her home office until midnight most nights, and because some things cannot wait until Monday. That was the beginning of the end of Devin Ashcroft's carefully built life, though neither of us knew it yet. I only knew one thing for certain, sitting in that dark car outside a house I had helped build without anyone realizing it. I was done being invisible in rooms I had paid for. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who I was before that September night, and who Devin had been to me for 6 years before that. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I was born in 1958 in a mill town outside Greensboro, North Carolina, to a father who worked textiles and a mother who cleaned houses on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I married Walter Whitfield in 1979, when I was 21 and he was 24, a quiet man with a head for numbers and a habit of buying real estate the way other men collected stamps. We had one son, Caleb, born in 1984. Walter died of a heart attack in December of 2011, on a Tuesday, in the kitchen of the house we'd lived in for 30 years. He was 56, I was 53. I inherited 31 rental properties, a modest portfolio of investments, and a grief I did not fully process for almost 2 years. I did not become a landlord by accident. Walter started with a single duplex in 1983, bought with a loan his own father co-signed, and by the time he died, he had taught me every part of the business: how to read a rent roll, how to negotiate with a contractor who was padding an invoice, how to walk a property in the rain because that was the only time you'd find the roof leak a seller hadn't mentioned. After he died, I could have sold everything and lived comfortably off the proceeds for the rest of my life. Several well-meaning friends suggested exactly that. Instead, I kept it, expanded it, learned tax law and zoning code and property insurance the way other widows learn to live alone. By 2015, I had grown the portfolio from 31 properties to 38. By the time of Caleb's wedding, I had 41, spread across North Carolina, South Carolina, and a small cluster in Virginia I'd acquired backyard almost as an afterthought. I managed all of it myself with one part-time bookkeeper and a property manager named Dwayne who had worked for Walter before me. I mention this only because Devin, in 6 years, never once asked me a single question about any of it. Not the vacancy rate, not the refinancing, not how a widow with a high school education and no law degree had quietly built something that outlasted 3 recessions. She had decided early on what category I belonged in, and she never revisited the decision. Caleb met Devin Ashcroft in 2017 when he was 33 and she was 31, both of them junior associates at different firms in Charlotte, introduced at a bar association mixer neither of them particularly wanted to attend. They married on June 14, 2019, at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. I paid for the flowers, Devin's family paid for everything else, and made sure everyone at the reception knew it. Devin's father, Gerald Ashcroft, was a name partner at Ashcroft, Pruitt, and Lang, though by the time of the wedding, he had mostly retired from active practice and served in an emeritus capacity. Devin had grown up in that firm's shadow the way some children grow up in a church, steeped in its language, aware of its status, hungry to prove she belonged there on her own merits rather than her father's name. I understood that hunger. I even respected it in the early years, before I understood what shape it would take. There was an earlier moment, actually, one I didn't recognize as significant until much later. During wedding planning in the spring of 2019, I offered to help cover the cost of the flowers and the rehearsal dinner, since Devin's parents were handling the venue and catering. I suggested gently that we use a florist I'd worked with for years, a woman named Rosalind who had done the arrangements for Walter's funeral and knew exactly how I liked things. Understated, seasonal, nothing that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Devin listened to the suggestion, thanked me, and then quietly booked a different florist entirely, one recommended by her mother, without telling me until the invoices had already gone out. When I asked about it, she said, "Rosalind's work is a little dated for what we're going for, Eleanor. No offense." I paid for flowers I hadn't chosen at a wedding I'd helped fund, and I told myself it was simply what mothers-in-law did, stepped back, let the bride have her vision. I did not yet understand that stepping back, with Devin, was rarely a single event. It was a pattern she would return to for the next 6 years, each time dressed in a slightly different justification, each time landing on the same conclusion. My preferences did not matter, and my money was welcome only when it came with no opinions attached. The first time I sensed what Devin was capable of in a way that truly unsettled me, we were at Thanksgiving in 2020, at Caleb and Devin's apartment, the year before Ren was born. Devin's associate at the time, a young woman named Priya Mehta, called her about a filing deadline that had somehow been missed. I was in the next room, setting the table, and I heard every word. "That is not my mistake, Priya," Devin said, her voice flat and cold in a way I hadn't heard her use with Caleb or his friends. "You had that assignment. You will fix it tonight, and you will not mention whose desk it started on. Do you understand me?" There was a pause. Then, "I don't care whose fault it actually was. I care whose fault it looks like." She hung up and returned to the table smiling, asking Caleb's uncle about his golf handicap. I remember thinking, watching her ladle gravy with that same easy smile, that I had just seen something true about my son's new wife, that she would never willingly show the rest of us. I said nothing. Caleb adored her. Ren wasn't born yet, but I could already picture a grandchild, and I did not want to be the mother-in-law who caused trouble in the first year of a marriage. That instinct to stay quiet, to let things slide, to protect the peace, would cost me a great deal over the next 6 years. By the time Ren arrived in March of 2022, Devin had softened toward me, or at least performed softening well enough that I let my guard down. She asked for my opinion on nursery colors. She let me hold Ren in the hospital for 20 minutes before anyone else. For about a year, I believed we might become something like family in the way I'd always hoped. Then Devin made junior partner track in 2023 and something in her recalibrated. I watched it happen in small increments, the way you watch a tide come in, not one wave, but 100 small ones, each pulling the shoreline back a little further, until one day you look up and the beach is gone. The story I'm about to tell you is the story of that tide. 5 moments over roughly 2 years, each one worse than the last, each one absorbed by me because I loved my son and I loved my granddaughter, and I believed, foolishly, that patience was a form of strength. The first came in the spring of 2023. Ren was turning 1, and I offered to host the birthday party at my house on Sycamore Lane, the same house Walter and I had raised Caleb in, the same backyard with the old oak tree Caleb had climbed as a boy. Devin told me, over the phone, in a tone so reasonable it took me a full day to recognize it as a dismissal, that she'd already booked a venue downtown. "It's just optics, Eleanor," she said. "Half the partners' families will be there. We need something that photographs well for the firm newsletter." I said that sounded lovely. I drove 40 minutes to a rented event space with balloon arches and a professional photographer, and I stood in the back of photos I wasn't asked to be centered in, watching a photographer arrange partners' wives and law school classmates around a high chair, while I held Ren's diaper bag near the coat check. Nobody asked me to step forward. I didn't offer. I told myself it didn't matter where the party was held, only that Ren was happy, blowing out a single candle in a room full of people who mostly didn't know my name. That was true, as far as it went. It was also the first ceiling Devin broke through, quietly, without ever having to raise her voice or say a cruel word out loud. And I let her, because the alternative felt like making a scene at a 1-year-old's birthday party over something as as small as a venue. The second came at Christmas of 2023. For 30 years, Christmas Eve had been at my house. It was tradition, the one thing Walter and I had built that outlasted him. Devin called me in early December to say that she and Caleb had decided to host Christmas Eve at their place that year to make it easier on Ren's schedule, and that I was welcome to come for a few hours in the afternoon before their real celebration began in the evening, when other guests, colleagues mostly, people from the firm, would arrive. I spent Christmas Eve of 2023 in my son's house for 2 hours, opening presents with Ren on the living room floor, and then I drove home alone before dark, before the real party started, before the people who mattered to Devin's career arrived. Caleb walked me to my car and hugged me for a long time. "Thanks for understanding, Mom," he said. "Devin's under a lot of pressure this year. Partner review committee starts looking at people in January." I understood. I always understood. That was the problem. The third moment involved money, and it came in August of 2024. Devin called me directly, which she rarely did, to say that Ren had been accepted into a private academy in Charlotte with a $14,000 annual tuition, and that she and Caleb were a little stretched that year given some renovations on the house. She wondered if I might help with the first year, just to get Ren settled. I said yes immediately. Of course I did. "It would mean so much to us," Devin had said on the phone, her voice softer than I'd heard it in months, almost like the version of her I'd met at the wedding. "Caleb's been so stressed about money this year, and I hate that Ren might miss out on Ashfield because of timing." I wired $15,000 to their account within the week, enough to cover tuition and a small cushion, and I felt, briefly, useful in a way I hadn't in a long time. Devin thanked me warmly on the phone, told me Ren was going to be so excited, said she didn't know what they'd do without me. 3 weeks later, at a family dinner, I overheard her telling her mother on speakerphone that Caleb's side isn't really in a position to help much, but we make it work. I sat 2 feet away, having just written a check for a private school, and said nothing. I told myself she simply hadn't wanted to embarrass me by mentioning the gift out loud, that some people were private about family finances and there was nothing sinister in it. I believed that story for almost a year, mostly because believing anything else would have meant admitting how easily I'd been managed. The fourth moment was the one that frightened me, because it involved Ren directly. In February of 2025, Ren and I had a disagreement, the kind 8-year-olds have with grandmothers, over whether she could have a second cookie before dinner. I said no. She cried. Devin, who had been in the next room, came in and told me, in front of Ren, that maybe I wasn't equipped to handle modern parenting boundaries, and that going forward, visits might need to be shorter and more structured, until I could get on the same page. She's 8, Devin, I said, trying to keep my voice light in front of Ren, who had stopped crying and was watching us both with the particular alertness children develop when they sense adults disagreeing on their behalf. "It's 1 cookie. I said no because dinner was 20 minutes away. "It's not about the cookie," Devin said. "It's about consistency. If Ren hears no from you and then gets a different answer from Caleb an hour later, that's confusing for her developmentally. I've read the research. I've raised a child before, Devin," I said, and I heard the edge creep into my own voice despite myself. "I know it isn't just about the cookie. Then you understand why I need you to follow our house rules when you're here," she said, already turning to scoop Ren up, already ending the conversation on her own terms, the way she ended most conversations that didn't go the direction she'd planned. I did not see Ren for 5 weeks after that. 5 weeks, over a cookie. I called Caleb gently, asking if I'd done something wrong. He said Devin just needed some space to feel like her parenting decisions were respected. I apologized to a woman I had done nothing to, because the alternative was losing time with my granddaughter, and I was not willing to risk that. I remember hanging up the phone after that apology, and standing in my kitchen for a long time, staring at a refrigerator covered in Ren's drawings, feeling something in me go quiet and hard in a way it hadn't before. I did not recognize it yet as the beginning of my own reckoning. I only knew that something had shifted, permanently, in how much more of myself I was willing to fold away to keep the peace. The fifth moment happened at Caleb's law firm's spring gala in April of 2025, 5 months before the partner party. Devin had introduced me to one of her colleagues as Caleb's mother. She used to be a secretary. I had never been a secretary. I had raised a family and managed a real estate portfolio Devin had never once asked about. I corrected her, gently, with a smile, and Devin laughed and said, "Oh, Eleanor, don't be modest," in front of 4 other lawyers, as though my correction were itself the embarrassing thing. The sixth moment, and the last before the party itself, happened over the phone in early September of 2025, just 2 weeks before Devin made partner. I had called to ask whether I could take Ren school shopping that weekend, a small tradition we'd kept since kindergarten. Devin answered instead of Caleb, and her voice had the brittle, distracted edge of someone under enormous pressure. "This really isn't a great week, Eleanor," she said. "I have the partner vote Thursday, and I need Caleb focused on getting Ren through her routine without extra disruptions. Maybe after things settle." "I understand completely," I said. "Would it help if I came by and just took her for the afternoon so you two have some quiet?" There was a pause, and then something in Devin's voice shifted. Not quite an apology, but close to one. "Actually, that would help a lot. I'm sorry. I've just been underwater. This partnership means everything to me. You know, I've been working toward it since I was 25. For one afternoon, driving Ren to buy pencil cases and a backpack with a cartoon fox on it, I let myself believe that Devin and I might be turning some kind of corner, that beneath 6 years years of small cruelties, there was simply an exhausted, overextended woman who had never learned a gentler way to ask for space. I held on to that belief for exactly 11 days, until I was standing by a dessert table in her living room, being told to stay away from the Callahans. I want to be honest about something here, because this story only works if I am honest. I was not a passive woman by nature. I had negotiated real estate deals that made grown men flinch. I had buried a husband and rebuilt a life at 53 with no manual and no help. But when it came to Devon, I made a choice over and over to be smaller than I was. I told myself it was for Ren. I told myself it was patience. Some of that was true, but some of it, I understand now, was fear. Fear that if I ever stood up to Devon the way I stood up to everyone else in my life, I would lose access to my granddaughter entirely. And that fear made me complicit in my own erasure for longer than I am proud of. There was one more detail from that period worth mentioning, because it would matter later, though I did not understand its significance at the time. In June of 2025, I drove to Ashcroft, Pruitt & Lang's downtown office to drop off some documents Caleb had asked me to bring by. He'd left his laptop charger at my house and needed a signed form delivered before a hearing. While I waited in the reception area, I saw Priya Mehta again, older now, a senior associate rather than the junior one from that Thanksgiving years earlier. She was crying quietly in a hallway alcove, on the phone with someone saying, "I did the entire Kessler brief myself and she's presenting it Thursday like it's hers. I have the drafts. I have the time-stamped drafts." She noticed me a moment later, straightened, wiped her face quickly, and lowered her voice to something more composed. "I have to go," she said into the phone, and hung up. "I'm sorry," she said to me, a stranger she likely recognized only vaguely as Caleb's mother. "Long week." "Those are the worst kind," I said, and left it there, because it wasn't my place to ask a young woman I barely knew to explain her tears to me in a law firm hallway. But something about the specific phrase she'd used, time-stamped drafts, stayed with me longer than it should have, the way a single odd word in an otherwise ordinary sentence sometimes does. I didn't think much of it that day. Not really. I had my own humiliations to carry, 6 years of them by then, and a stranger's bad day at the office seemed small by comparison. I filed it away the way you file away a stranger's bad day, and I drove home, and I did not think of Priya Mehta again until she was calling Devon's phone in a conference room 3 months later. That was the world Devon and I lived in for 6 years. A slow, patient erosion, dressed up as reasonableness, each slight small enough to swallow, each swallow making the next one a little easier to force down. By the time I stood at that September party watching my granddaughter peer out from behind a banister in her nightgown, I had absorbed so many small cruelties that I almost didn't recognize the big one for what it was. Almost. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I did not go home that night after leaving the party. I drove straight to Renata Ford's house, a modest brick colonial in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from mine, and I sat in her home office at 9:30 with my coat still on while she made 2 cups of tea neither of us drank. Renata had been my attorney for 14 years since Walter's estate had needed sorting, and she knew the shape of my finances better than my own son did. She listened to what had happened at the party without interrupting, her pen moving occasionally across a legal pad, and when I finished, she set the pen down. "You've never told her," Renata said. It wasn't a question. "No, not even Caleb knows the full extent of it. He knows I own property. He doesn't know about Ashcroft, Pruitt & Lang. Here is what I hadn't told anyone, not even my own son, for 11 years. In 2014, 3 years after Walter died, the firm then known simply as Pruitt & Lang was a small but well-regarded practice, occupying leased office space in a building whose landlord was threatening a punishing rent increase that would have forced them out of downtown Charlotte entirely. Marcus Pruitt, the senior name partner, was an old acquaintance of Walter's from a Rotary Club decades earlier. He came to me quietly through a mutual friend, asking whether Whitfield Holdings, my real estate company, might be interested in purchasing the building outright and leasing it back to the firm at a stable, below-market rate. I did more than that. I structured a deal, with Renata's help, in which Whitfield Holdings acquired the building and I personally took a minority equity stake in the law practice itself, in exchange for capital that let the firm expand, hire associates, and eventually attract Gerald Ashcroft, whose client list and name recognition transformed the practice into Ashcroft, Pruitt & Lang within 2 years. My stake, diluted and then increased again through subsequent capital infusions over the following decade, sat at 46% by the time Devon made partner. I had asked at the outset that my involvement remain confidential, structured through a trust rather than my personal name, listed on the operating agreement only as WH Capital Trust. I did not want tenants speculating about me, and frankly, I did not want to be treated any differently by a firm my son might one day need to hire, or work for, or marry into. It was supposed to be a quiet, sensible investment. I never imagined it would become a weapon I'd need to use against my own family. Pull every document related to the firm, I told Renata that night. Every stakeholder right I have under the operating agreement. I want it on my desk by morning. She did not ask why. Not really. She had known me long enough to understand that when I asked for documents at 9:30 on a Saturday night, something had finally broken. By 8 the next morning, Renata called me with what she'd found. Under the firm's operating agreement, last amended in 2021, 2021, when Gerald Ashcroft formally stepped back into emeritus status, any stakeholder holding more than 30% beneficial interest retained the right to demand a formal governance review of any new equity partner's admission, provided that review was requested within 90 days of the partnership vote. Devon's promotion had been finalized 11 days earlier. I was well within the window. The review, per the agreement, required a full committee hearing, mandatory attendance from the newly elevated partner, a presentation of the case for admission, subject to formal challenge from the requesting stakeholder. It was, Renata explained, an extraordinarily rare provision, written into the original agreement back in 2014, largely at my own request, as a safeguard I'd never expected to actually use. You understand what this means, Eleanor, Renata said. If you file this, you're not just embarrassing her, you're putting her partnership itself under review in front of the entire equity committee. I thought about the dessert table. I thought about 14 faces turning away from me. I thought about Wren peering out from behind the banister, watching her mother call her grandmother an embarrassment. I don't want to take her partnership away, I said. She earned that, whatever else is true about her. I want her to understand exactly whose house she threw me out of. File it, I told Renata. I want the review scheduled for Thursday afternoon. The 4 days between that call and the Thursday hearing were the strangest of my life. I did not tell Caleb. I did not tell Devon. I went about my week, a property inspection in Matthews, lunch with Marjorie Callahan, who apologized profusely for what had happened and confessed she'd been horrified into silence, and I said nothing about what was coming. Renata assembled a file nearly 2 inches thick, the original 2014 stock purchase agreement, amendment histories, capital contribution records, my trust documentation, and a formal notice of review that had already been delivered to the firm's general counsel and, per procedure, to Devon herself, though the notice identified the requesting party only as WH Capital Trust, holder of record. I learned later from Renata that this notice had thrown the firm into a quiet, controlled panic for 2 days. Nobody currently active in firm leadership, not Wallace Doyle, the managing partner, not the young associates, not even Gerald Ashcroft, who was mostly retired and playing golf in Hilton Head, could say with certainty who WH Capital Trust actually was. The original 2014 documents had been handled personally by Marcus Pruitt, who had died of cancer in 2019, taking most of the specifics with him. There were perhaps 2 people alive who knew the trust's beneficial owner was a 67-year-old woman in a navy dress who had been asked to stay by the dessert table 11 days earlier. One was Renata, the other was me. Thursday came fast. I dressed carefully that morning, the same navy dress from the party. A small, deliberate choice I am not ashamed to admit was theater. I wanted Devon to recognize the dress before she recognized my face. Renata picked me up at noon, and we drove downtown together, the leather folder of exhibits resting on her lap like something sacred. The offices of Ashcroft, Pruitt, and Lang occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on Trade Street. I had never once been inside, in all the years my son's wife had worked there. We took the elevator to the 22nd floor, where a conference room with a wall of windows overlooking the city had been reserved for 2 o'clock. I arrived 12 minutes early, as I do for everything. Wallace Doyle met us at the door. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s, the kind of managing partner who had clearly spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and he shook my hand with the careful, uncertain grip of a man who did not know what category to place me in. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, we appreciate you coming in person. Most beneficial trust holders send counsel alone. I wanted to see her face, I said, and left it at that. We sat. Renata arranged the exhibits. 2 other committee members filed in, a woman named Constance Reyes, head of the equity committee, and an older man I didn't catch the name of, introduced only as outside counsel retained for governance matters. The room smelled like fresh coffee and expensive carpet. Then the door opened, and Devon walked in mid-sentence, talking to a junior associate trailing behind her with a stack of files, radiating the same confidence she'd worn all night at her own party 11 days earlier. She was laughing at something. She had not yet looked up. She saw Renata first, recognition flickering across her face. Renata had, after all, attended Wren's baptism, though as a family friend, rather than in any professional capacity Devon would have connected to her firm. Then Devon's eyes moved to me. I watched her face change in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't fear yet. It was confusion, the particular disorientation of seeing 2 unrelated parts of your life suddenly, impossibly occupying the same room. Mom, Eleanor, she said, catching herself. What are you doing here? Wallace cleared his throat and opened his folder before I could answer. Ms. Ashcroft, please have a seat. This is a formally requested governance review, initiated under Section 9.4 of the operating agreement. Devon sat, slowly, her eyes still moving between Renata's folder and my face. This review was requested, Wallace continued, reading from a prepared statement, by the firm's principal outside stakeholder, holding a 46% beneficial interest under the WH Capital Trust, established in 2014. He looked up directly at Devon. Ms. Ashcroft, do you know who that stakeholder is? Devon's mouth opened. No sound came out. I watched her mind work. I could see her running through every partner, every client, every wealthy name she'd ever encountered in 6 years at that firm, searching for someone with 46% and finding nothing. Wallace turned to me. Mrs. Whitfield, the floor is yours. I stood up slowly, smoothing the navy dress, and I looked at Devon's pale, frozen face for a long moment before I spoke. 11 days ago, I said, you told your husband's family friend in front of 30 guests not to speak to the Callahans. You told her I would embarrass everyone. You asked someone to remove me from your house before your important guests could see me. I let that sit in the air. I want you to know before this review goes any further exactly what you did that night. You didn't embarrass an old woman who used to be a secretary. You embarrassed the reason there's a law firm for you to have made partner at. That is the exact moment Devon's phone, resting face up on the conference table where she'd set it out of habit, lit up and began to buzz. I watched her eyes drop to the screen. I watched every trace of color drain from her face before she'd even fully processed the name flashing there. I leaned forward just slightly to see it myself. Priya Mehta. Devon's hand moved toward the phone and then stopped, hovering, as though touching it might make whatever was coming arrive faster. Wallace Doyle glanced at the screen too, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, quickly masked. You can take that later, Wallace said carefully. We have other business to address today as well. Ms. Reyes received a formal complaint this morning from Ms. Mehta's counsel regarding billing attribution on the Kessler matter. We were going to raise it after the governance review concluded. I hadn't known that. I want to be honest. I had not engineered that, had not known about it, had assembled no case against Devon beyond the plain fact of what she'd said to me at her own party. But sitting there, watching her face as two separate reckonings arrived in the same conference room within the same 60 seconds, I understood something about the kind of woman Devon Ashcroft actually was. She hadn't just humiliated an old woman she assumed had nothing. She had apparently spent years taking credit that belonged to someone else, certain that no one beneath her would ever have the standing to say so out loud. Overreach, it turns out, rarely announces itself as a single act. It's a habit, and habits eventually collect their own witnesses. What complaint? Devon said very quietly, still staring at the buzzing phone. Constance Reyes opened a slim folder of her own. Ms. Mehta has submitted time-stamped drafts of the Kessler appellate brief, along with email correspondence, alleging that credit for the work and the billing hours associated with it were attributed to you rather than to her, in violation of firm policy and potentially state bar rules on truthful representation of authorship in fee petitions. The phone stopped buzzing. Then, almost immediately, it began again. Devon, Wallace said, his voice losing its earlier careful neutrality. I'd suggest you let it go to voicemail. She didn't. She picked it up with a shaking hand and silenced it, then set it face down on the table as though hiding the screen might undo the last 90 seconds. I sat back down. Renata slid the stock purchase agreement across the table toward Wallace, the paper crisp and official. My name, my actual legal name, Eleanor Marie Whitfield trustee, visible at the bottom beside a signature from 2014. I don't want her partnership revoked, I said to the room, though I was looking at Devon. I said that to my attorney 4 days ago, and I mean it now. She earned her seat at this firm through work I know nothing about, and I won't pretend to. But I want this committee, and I want her, to understand something clearly. I am not a woman without standing in this building. I have not been for 11 years. And the next time she decides someone doesn't deserve to be spoken to at a party, I would ask that she find out first exactly who she's talking to. Devon's face had gone through several colors by then. White, then a blotchy, humiliated red creeping up from her collar. She looked, for the first time in 6 years, genuinely young to me. Not powerful, not radiant, just a woman in her late 30s who had built a version of herself on the assumption that certain people simply didn't matter, and who was now discovering, in real time, in front of the 2 committee members who controlled her entire professional future, how wrong that assumption had been. I didn't know, Devon said, and her voice cracked slightly. Eleanor, I swear I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. That was rather the point of not telling you. Constance Reyes, who had been quiet until then, leaned forward with the careful precision of a woman used to cross-examination. Ms. Ashcroft, I want to be clear about the record here, because this committee will need to document today's proceedings. Are you stating that you were unaware of Mrs. Whitfield's beneficial interest in this firm at any point during your tenure? Yes, Devon said, completely unaware. And yet, Constance continued, you were comfortable describing her on multiple occasions, according to what I'm now hearing, as someone unworthy of introduction to this firm's clients. Devon didn't answer. The junior associate who'd followed her into the room, a young man holding a stack of files no one needed anymore, shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly wishing he'd waited outside. I'd like to note, Wallace Doyle said, that Mrs. Whitfield's standing in this firm has never been in question, and never will be, regardless of how this review concludes. What's in question today is whether this committee has confidence in Ms. Ashcroft's judgment going forward, given what we're now learning on 2 separate fronts within the same hour. Devon's eyes moved to me, and for just a moment, something raw and unguarded passed across her face. Not the practiced warmth she'd worn at the party, not the icy control she'd used on Priya over the phone 5 years earlier, but something closer to a frightened woman watching 2 decades of careful self-construction come apart in front of strangers she'd need to keep working alongside for years. Is there anything you'd like to say to Mrs. Whitfield directly? Wallace asked. Before we move to the ethics matter? Devon looked at me for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said finally quietly, and I believed in that instant that she meant it, not because she'd suddenly become a different person, but because humiliation, real humiliation, has a way of stripping performance down to something true, at least briefly. I don't have an an excuse. I looked at you and decided you didn't matter, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Thank you for saying that, I said. I mean that. But I'd ask you to remember it wasn't really about me being an heiress you didn't know about. It was about a person standing in front of you, asking to be treated with basic decency, regardless of what she owned. Wallace Doyle cleared his throat again, clearly eager to move the room back toward procedure. Given the nature of this disclosure and the pending complaint from Ms. Mehta, I'd like to propose we table the governance review itself. Ms. Whitfield has indicated she does not wish to contest the partnership admission, and instead convene a separate ethics inquiry regarding the Kessler matter, effective immediately. Ms. Ashcroft, you'll be asked to step back from client-facing work pending that inquiry. Devin nodded mechanically, staring at a spot on the table. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to. I had spent 6 years being made small in rooms I had every right to stand tall in, and here, finally, was a room where the truth of who I was could not be dismissed or laughed off or excused as modesty. But watching Devin Ashcroft, 38 years old, partner for 11 days, sit there absorbing the collapse of the identity she'd built her entire adult life around, I felt something closer to sorrow than triumph. I had wanted her to know my worth. I had not particularly wanted to watch her lose everything in the same afternoon. I stood, gathered my coat, and left the conference room before the meeting fully adjourned. Renata followed a moment later, the folder of exhibits tucked under her arm. You didn't have to leave her the escape route, Renata said quietly, in the elevator. You could have pushed harder, demanded her removal. You had every right to. I know, I said. I didn't want to become her. The days that followed were not quiet. Word travels fast inside a law firm, faster still inside a family. By that Saturday, 1 week after the review, Caleb called me, and I could hear in the first 2 words that he already knew. Mom, he said, why didn't you tell me? I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table Walter and I had bought in 1985, and I told him everything. The trust, the 2014 deal, 11 years of quiet ownership I'd never mentioned because I had never needed to. I told him gently about the party, about what Devin had said to Marjorie Callahan, about the 14 faces that turned away from me. I had never told him that part before. I watched, in the silence on the other end of the phone, my son absorbing a version of his wife he hadn't previously been permitted to see. She told me you left early because you were tired, he said finally. I was tired, I said, just not in the way she meant. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The ethics thing. Priya Mehta. Is that connected to what you did? No, I said honestly. I didn't know about that until I was sitting in the room. I promise you, Caleb, I went there to make a point about how I was treated. What happened with Priya was Devin's doing, entirely separate, and it would have surfaced with or without me. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, I need some time, Mom. Not from you. From all of it. The firm's internal investigation into the Kessler matter took 6 weeks. I learned most of it secondhand, through Renata, who maintained a professional relationship with Wallace Doyle given my continued stake in the practice. Priya Mehta's documentation was thorough, time-stamped drafts going back 14 months, emails in which Devin had explicitly instructed her, in language eerily similar to what I'd overheard at that Thanksgiving dinner in 2020, to let it go to the file under my name, it's cleaner that way. 2 other associates, once the investigation opened a door they'd apparently been waiting years for someone to open, came forward with similar smaller complaints. Credit reassigned, hours reallocated, junior staff quietly instructed to stay silent about whose work had actually produced the results Devin was billed and praised for. Devin was not disbarred. The complaints, while serious, fell short of the threshold for state bar discipline, settling instead into an internal firm sanction. Her partnership was suspended for 18 months, converted to a non-equity salaried position with client-facing restrictions, subject to review. It was, by any measure, a humiliation far more public and far more permanent than anything that had happened to her at that September party. Legal Charlotte is a small world. People talked. A local business journal ran a short item about governance disputes at Ashcroft, Pruitt, and Lang, careful with names but not so careful that anyone inside the profession failed to understand what had happened. Gerald Ashcroft, Devin's father, flew back from Hilton Head for an emergency meeting with the Equity Committee. I never learned exactly what was said in that meeting, but Renata told me Gerald requested formally to meet with me, the first and only time in 6 years he had ever asked to see me directly, rather than through his daughter or my son. We met at a coffee shop near my office, not the firm's building, at his request. He was 71, silver-haired, still sharp-eyed despite his years of golf course retirement, and he sat across from me with the particular discomfort of a powerful man forced to acknowledge he'd misjudged someone. I didn't know it was you, he said without preamble. In 2014, Marcus never told me who WH Capital Trust actually was. I assumed it was some institutional fund. Marcus asked me to keep it quiet, I said. I wanted it that way too. My daughter, he started and then stopped, choosing his next words carefully. My daughter has always believed that being taken seriously meant never appearing to need anyone. I don't know where that came from. Possibly me. He looked down at his coffee. I'm sorry for what she said to you. I raised her better than that, or I thought I did. I didn't offer him easy forgiveness because it wasn't mine to give on Devin's behalf, and because I'd learned over 6 years that apologies delivered by proxy rarely changed anything that mattered. But I appreciated that he'd come. It was more than his daughter had managed in the 2 months since the party. Caleb and Devin separated in December, 3 months after that September night. Though separated is perhaps too clean a word for what actually happened. Devin moved into a rented apartment near the office, and Caleb stayed in the house with Ren, and the two of them entered a slow, lawyer-mediated process of figuring out custody, finances, and whatever remained salvageable of 11 years together. I did not push for the separation. I want to be clear about that. Whatever happened between my son and his wife happened because of choices Devin made long before I ever walked into that conference room. The years of small cruelties toward me were, I came to understand, simply the version of her character that had been safe for Caleb to witness up close. The version at work, the one that took Priya Mehta's work and called it her own, was the same character wearing a different coat. Devin's mother, a woman named Patricia, I had met perhaps a dozen times in 6 years, always cordial and always distant, called me in late January, 3 weeks after the separation was announced within the family. I expected hostility. Instead, she sounded tired, older than I remembered. "I owe you an apology too, Eleanor," she said. I raised Devin to believe that being underestimated was the worst thing that could happen to a woman, and somewhere along the way, she decided the solution was to make sure she was never in a room with anyone she considered beneath her. I watched her do it for years and told myself it was ambition. "I'm sorry it landed on you the way it did." I told her I appreciated the call, and I meant it, though I noticed she never once suggested Devin herself might make a similar one. She didn't. Not that winter, not that spring. The closest Devin came was a text message in February, 4 words long, "I really am sorry," sent at 11 at night, unanswered by me for 2 days because I genuinely did not know what to say back to it that wouldn't reopen a wound still healing. Extended family split along predictable lines, though not entirely the ones I'd expected. Caleb's cousin, Marissa, who had always found Devin a little cold, stopped speaking to her almost immediately and began inviting me to things I hadn't been invited to in years. Devin's own sister, Blair, surprised me by reaching out directly, apologizing on behalf of a family that had, in her words, spent 30 years teaching Devin that winning mattered more than kindness, and asking if she could still bring her kids to see Ren occasionally, given how close the cousins had grown. I said, of course. Whatever had broken between Devin and me, I saw no reason to break it for children who'd done nothing but grow up loving each other. The unexpected ally, if I can call her that, was Priya Mehta. She reached out to me in March, nearly 6 months after the party, through a brief, careful email that Renata forwarded, once she'd confirmed it wasn't some kind of legal entanglement. Priya wanted to thank me, though she was quick to clarify she understood I hadn't orchestrated anything on her behalf. We met for coffee at the same shop where I'd later see Gerald Ashcroft. She was younger than I'd remembered from that Thanksgiving 5 years earlier, 31 now, sharp and still a little guarded. "I want to be clear," she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "I filed that complaint because of what she did to me, not because of anything happening with you, but I won't pretend it didn't help, timing-wise. For years, I told myself I was imagining the pattern. Watching someone else finally see it too, even by accident, made me trust my own read on her again. You did the hard part," I told her. "You kept the drafts, you kept the timestamps. I just happened to be sitting in the room when it mattered." She smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her. For what it's worth, she was good to work for, in the beginning. Sharp, generous with her time, actually. I think she got scared somewhere along the way that being good wasn't going to be enough, and it curdled into something else. It was a more generous read than I might have offered myself, but I found I appreciated her willingness to hold both truths at once. That Devin had been capable of better, and that better hadn't survived contact with her ambition. The custody arrangement between Caleb and Devin finalized in April, after a mediation process that dragged 4 months longer than either of them wanted. Devin kept a modified schedule, Ren with her every other weekend and one weeknight, the rest of the time with Caleb, who kept the house on a mortgage. I quietly helped refinance once his own finances contracted, under the weight of a suspended partner's reduced salary, supporting 2 households instead of 1. I want to be honest that I did not offer that help entirely without motive. I wanted my granddaughter to keep her home, her school, her oak tree, and I had the means to make sure a divorce didn't cost an 8-year-old the only stability she'd ever known. Devin, for her part, made one last attempt in March to have the governance review documents sealed or amended, arguing through her own separate counsel that the timing of my filing, 4 days after the party, suggested retaliatory intent that should be examined by the firm's board. Wallace Doyle rejected the motion within a week, noting, dryly, in his written response, that a stakeholder exercising a contractual right within the 90-day window provided for exactly that purpose could hardly be accused of impropriety, regardless of what prompted her to finally use it. There was a quiet grief in all of it that surprised me. I had wanted Devin to see me clearly. I had not particularly wanted my son's marriage to end, or my granddaughter's parents to separate, or a woman I'd once hoped might become something like a daughter to lose the career she'd spent her whole life building. Late one night in January, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. Not for what Devin had done to me, but for the version of her I'd glimpsed occasionally over the years. The one who'd let me hold Ren for 20 minutes in the hospital. The one who'd asked my opinion on nursery colors. The one who might have become family under different circumstances. That version of Devin Ashcroft was real too, even if it hadn't been strong enough to survive contact with her own ambition. Ren, mercifully, was shielded from most of it. She was 8, old enough to notice her parents living apart, but young enough that the explanations, grown-up things, nothing to worry about, mostly satisfied her. She still called called me every Sunday afternoon. A new arrangement Caleb and I had settled into, and she still climbed the same oak tree in my backyard that her father had climbed 30 years earlier. Renata handled the mechanics of everything that followed with the same steady competence she'd brought to that Thursday hearing. My stake in the firm remained unchanged, 46%, quietly held, structured as it had always been through WH Capital Trust, though Wallace Doyle now called me personally twice a year, rather than leaving everything to correspondence. I did not seek any additional power over the firm. I did not attend more meetings than the operating agreement required. I had gotten what I needed from that Thursday afternoon, which was never really about the firm at all. There was, however, one change I did request in early spring, once the dust had settled enough for me to think clearly about what I actually wanted going forward. I asked Wallace to establish a formal mentorship stipend for junior associates, funded quietly out of my own distributions rather than the firm's general budget, administered by Constance Reyes rather than by any partner directly supervising the associates in question. I asked that Priya Mehta be the first recipient, though I structured the request carefully enough that it wouldn't read as a reward for her complaint, only as recognition of the seniority and expertise she'd earned and rarely been credited for. Wallace agreed without hesitation. I think, by then, he understood that saying no to me was not a productive use of anyone's time, though he was gracious enough never to phrase it that way. Renata told me, months later, over one of our regular lunches, that word of the stipend had traveled quietly through the associate ranks the way good news travels in places accustomed mostly to bad, carefully, almost disbelievingly, checked against other sources before anyone allowed themselves to be glad about it. Two associates I'd never met sent handwritten thank you notes to Renata's office, unsure of how else to reach me. I kept them in a drawer in my kitchen, alongside Wren's old school photos and Walter's watch, small proof that something good had grown out of a night I'd once have given anything to undo. Marjorie Callahan and I remained close, closer than before, in fact. She'd been horrified by what she witnessed at the party and had, in the weeks after, made a point of including me in gatherings Devon would once have gate-kept me out of. She called me the Monday after the party, before any of the governance review had even begun, simply to say she was sorry she hadn't spoken up in the moment. "I've known you almost 40 years, Eleanor," she said. "I should have said something to that girl right then and there. I just froze." "You didn't need to say anything," I told her. "I handled it in my own time." "Knowing you," Marjorie said with a small laugh that told me she already suspected something was coming. "I imagine you did." She had no idea that Monday just how literally true that would turn out to be. When she found out, weeks later, about the trust and the 46%, she called me again, laughing so hard she could barely get the words out. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, "you let that woman order your dinner for 6 years and you owned half her law firm the entire time. I don't know whether to be furious with you or in awe of you." I told her both reactions seemed fair. There is a particular kindness in a friend who is present for your worst public moment and chooses afterward to make sure you're never made small again in front of her. Caleb and I are closer now than we were in the years Devon and I circled each other carefully around his loyalty. He apologized to me, eventually, not for anything he'd done wrong exactly, but for not seeing what had been happening in plain sight for 6 years. I told him he didn't need to apologize. Sons rarely see what their mothers absorb quietly to keep a family peaceful. It isn't a failure of love. It's simply the blind spot love creates. It has been 8 months since that September party. I still live in the house on Sycamore Lane, under the same oak tree, and Wren still climbs it every Sunday when Caleb drops her off, her sneakers finding the same worn grooves in the bark her father's did 30 years before her. Dwayne still manages the properties with me on Tuesday mornings, the same as always. My 46% of Ashcroft, Pruitt, and Lang remains exactly what it was before any of this happened. A quiet, sensible investment I made 11 years ago to help an old acquaintance keep his law firm's lights on. Not a weapon I ever wanted to use, only one I was finally willing to. I think about that navy dress sometimes, hanging in my closet now, retired from further service. I think about 14 faces turning away from me at a dessert table, and about the particular loneliness of being underestimated by people who claim to love you. I don't regret what I did that Thursday. I regret, if I regret anything, that it took 6 years of small humiliations before I finally stood up in a room and said, clearly, exactly what I was worth. I think of all the dinners where I let a comment slide because I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law, all the Christmases I accepted 2 quiet hours instead of asking for the whole evening I was owed, all the times I told myself that patience was the same thing as strength. Some of it was, not all of it. There is a version of patience that is really just fear wearing a nicer coat, and I wore that coat for 6 years without ever quite admitting it to myself. Devon and I have not spoken since the separation was finalized this spring. I don't know if we ever will again, not in any meaningful way. Wren asks about her occasionally, and I answer honestly and gently, because whatever else Devon Ashcroft did to me, she is still Wren's mother, and that fact deserves more grace than I sometimes feel like giving it. I heard through Renata that Devon's 18-month suspension has gone quietly. No further complaints, careful, closely supervised work, the particular humility of someone rebuilding a reputation one small task at a time. I hope, honestly, that she comes out the other side of it a better version of the woman I met at that vineyard wedding in 2019. I am not owed that outcome, but I find I still want it for Wren's sake, and perhaps, in some smaller similar way, for the sake of the woman who once let me hold my granddaughter for 20 minutes in a hospital room and asked my opinion on nursery colors, before ambition taught her that kindness toward people who couldn't help her career was a currency not worth spending. People ask me when they hear this story whether I feel vindicated. I tell them the truth. Vindication and peace are not the same thing, and I only ever wanted the second one. Vindication is loud. It wants an audience, a scoreboard, a moment where everyone in the room finally sees you the way you always knew yourself to be. I got a version of that in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a glass tower, and I won't pretend it didn't feel good, watching Wallace Doyle read my name off a document Devin had never thought to ask about. But peace is quieter than that. Peace is Sunday afternoons under an oak tree. Peace is a granddaughter who still doesn't fully understand what happened, only that her grandmother seems lighter these days, easier to laugh with, less careful about which words she chooses at the dinner table. I sat silently for 6 years, while a woman who never bothered to learn who I was called me a pathetic embarrassment in my own son's house, in front of guests I'd never meet again. I am not silent anymore. That is the only victory I actually needed. Not the 46%, not the conference room, not even the apology I got and half believed. Just the plain, simple fact that I will never again let a room decide I don't belong in it without first finding out exactly who I am.